Thanks for coming to today's Biology Chemistry Science Friday. Our first speaker today is Gretchen Keppel-Aleks from the University of Michigan. Take it away, Gretchen.
Thanks, Forrest. I'm going to be talking about a study that we did to identify the regional influences on Northern Hemisphere atmospheric CO2 seasonal amplification. I want to acknowledge a former postdoc, Sean Lin, who did most of the research that I'll be talking about. And I want to get started off by looking at this figure, which is a Molar diagram of the atmospheric CO2 seasonal amplitude. So we have latitude on the y-axis from the far southern hemisphere up to the far northern hemisphere, and then month of the year on the x-axis. And this is just a climatological composite of NOAA marine boundary layer stations. So you can see that there's a lot of seasonality in CO2 in the northern hemisphere, which is driven by terrestrial biospheric activity, which draws down CO2 during the summer. And then you have net respiration outside the growing season that brings the CO2 back up. You can see that that amplitude is strongest the further north that you go. And recent observations have suggested that that amplitude has been increasing with time, really since the late 1950s when the CO2 observational record began. So these are a couple of figures from a paper by Heather Graven in 2013, where they looked at the surface stations. You can see Barrow, which is in the north of Alaska, and Mauna Loa, which is in Hawaii, have shown seasonal cycle increases of 0.6% per year at Barrow, 0.3% per year at Mauna Loa. And we can see those trends at the surface. And then if you look at the bottom, you can also see those trends at 500 millibars. So they used two different aircraft campaigns, one in the late 1950s and one between 2009 and 2011, and juxtapose the seasonality that was observed there. And you can likewise see this increase in amplitude. So the earlier observations in black and the later observations in purple. And once again, you can see that there's a differential increase with the amplitude increasing further to the north. And in that paper, they do a quick sort of attribution to look at what regions are contributing to the observed seasonality. So if you look over on the right, they've split up the globe into these coarse regions, and then they look at what those regions contribute to the CO2 seasonal cycle at 20 degrees north, close to where Mauna Loa is, either at the surface or at 500 millibar, and then at 70 degrees north, close to Barrow, at the surface and at 500 millibar. And you can see that the different regions sort of contribute different amounts to the CO2 seasonal cycle. So at Mauna Loa, a greater fraction is owing to subtropical and temperate ecosystems, whereas at 70 degrees north, you can see that there's a bigger contribution from boreal ecosystems. And this differential influence of different regions on the CO2 seasonal cycle gives us the power to do sort of a more in-depth attribution of where that increase to the seasonal amplitude is coming from. And we'd like to be able to do that because this is really one of the unambiguous signals that we have that the carbon cycle is changing and that it's very likely tied to human causes, either climate change or CO2 fertilization, or as we'll see later on, maybe land use change effects. So we're going to be presenting results from an atmospheric inversion study. So what atmospheric inversions do is take advantage of the fact that there is a differential flux footprint for different areas where you can measure atmospheric CO2. So atmospheric CO2 integrates fluxes over a very large area, which makes it great as sort of an ultimate constraint on how the overall carbon cycle is responding, but it makes it a little bit more different to understand local influence. So what I'm showing in these figures are footprint maps from 4 high latitude surface CO2 observations, and we've run back trajectories. So you can see in red the surface regions that contribute a lot to observations obtained at those sites. And then as you move to bluer colors, those are regions that still influence the CO2 that you would observe at that site, but only sporadically or to a lesser extent. And so you can see that these sites are sensitive to a large flux area, and that each site has a slightly different flux footprint that it's sensitive to. So when we use all of these observations in conjunction, we can do a formal inversion where we make a guess at surface fluxes. We run those fluxes through an atmospheric transport model to simulate CO2, and then we can compare it to CO2 observations and figure out where and when there are mismatches and adjust the surface fluxes to try to best match what's going on at all of those sites. So what we're doing in this study is taking results from two publicly available inversions, the CAMS inversion and carbon tracker. And these are two different approaches. They use different atmospheric transport models. They use different land fluxes and ocean fluxes as prior guesses as to how atmospheric CO2 should be responding. And as you can see on these maps, they assimilate information from a different set of CO2 observations. So CAMS, the inversion runs from 1979 to 2017. And the sites that you see here are sites that are assimilated into that inversion in 2017. But the approach that they take is they use sites as they come online. So you'd have a very different map constraining 1979 fluxes compared to the present fluxes. And those four sites I showed you on the previous slides are the green triangles that you see on the left. Carbon tracker uses a slightly different set of sites. It is only doing an inversion for a more recent period between 2000 and 2016. But because it's looking exclusively at a more modern record, there are sites that have come online that it can take advantage of. Namely, you'll see in green a set of towers in Siberia. And one of the key conclusions that we have drawn from this study is that there's a big asymmetry in the extent to which Siberia versus boreal North America is contributing to seasonal amplification, and that Siberian fluxes are driving amplification, whereas North American boreal and Arctic fluxes don't have much of an imprint. So the fact that those towers exist is going to be key for validating some of the conclusions that we're drawing. So we take these two posterior fluxes from these inversions, so those are the optimized fluxes that should match atmospheric CO2, and we simulate CO2 from those fluxes using the GEOS-Chem atmospheric transport model. But the approach that we take is to divide those surface fluxes into different regions, which you can see on this map. And each of those regions then, the CO2 that originates from within the boundaries is essentially a separate species in the atmosphere. So it's tracked separately as winds advect the CO2 throughout the planet. So in the study, the results are going to focus a lot on Arctic, boreal North America, Northern Europe, Siberia, and temperate ecosystems, which you can see labeled on the map here. So we're looking at relatively coarse regions. But what we can do then is simulate the CO2 originating from those regions, and we can sum those species together to estimate what the global total would be. So something comparable to observations. You can see in this time series from Barrow, the black line represents the observed seasonal cycle. The gray line represents the simulated CO2 when you include fluxes from all of those global regions. And then the colors show the contribution just from the three of those ecosystems: Arctic, boreal North America, Siberia, and temperate ecosystems. So everything sums linearly, and that will give us some ability to identify what regions are contributing to the seasonal cycle and its amplification. And then a really important component of this, because atmospheric inversions are subject to a lot of uncertainty, is we're going to evaluate the results against a combination of measurements. So you can see in black circles surface sites that are part of NOAA's network. You can see in the open circles, those are towers within Siberia that were not assimilated into the CAMS inversion. And then the colored triangles represent locations where we have aircraft observations. All right, so at the surface sites, we're gonna pay careful attention to the mean and trend in the seasonal cycle. So just to be illustrative, I've put thumbnails from 3 high latitude sites. So the black are observations, the red is going to be CAMs, and the blue is going to be the carbon tracker results. You can see really clearly that the shorter duration of the carbon tracker inversion means we're going to focus much more on the CAMs results in this paper. But you can see that there tends to be pretty good agreement in the slope of the seasonal cycle with respect to time, although there are some mean biases that that aren't coherent from site to site. And I've also put Mauna Loa up there just for reference because people are used to looking at it. So we're going to use comparisons with surface sites to validate, and then comparisons with aircraft. And so what SEEN has done is taken aircraft profiles from 3 different data sources: NOAA, Contrail, and NICE CGER observations, which are made over a tower in Siberia. And she's made composites. So if there's overlap in a model grid cell between the NOAA record and the Contrail record, all of the data are used for comparison. And so you can see a Molar diagram with altitude and time for CO2 over a grid cell that would be over Alaska on the left. And then you can see what a climatological profile looks like on the right. And these aircraft data are pretty useful because one of the big weaknesses in atmospheric transport models is getting vertical mixing correct. So we're going to use the difference between CO2 in the lower free troposphere between 3 and 4 kilometers and CO2 measured between the surface and 1 kilometer as a diagnostic of whether we can trust agreement at the surface to be due to getting fluxes and transport pretty correct versus whether things look pretty correct because there's compensating errors between the fluxes and the transport. So we find that when we do these tagged simulations in GEOS-Chem, that we do a pretty good job of capturing the simulated mean CO2 amplitude. So that's what this figure is showing. Assimilated sites are filled circles, and the non-assimilated sites in Siberia are open circles. So you can see that in general, we're getting the mean state correct at low latitude sites in blue, mid latitude sites in green, and high latitude sites in salmon. I don't know what color that is. And you can also see, clearly that there's that increase with latitude that we saw based on the Molar diagram on the first page. And this is just an inset showing those Siberian sites. Again, CAMS is in red and carbon tracker is in blue. And you can see that even though CAMS isn't assimilating those sites, the magnitude of the CO2 seasonal cycle is pretty faithful, even though there's not a strong correlation among these sites within CAMS. There's a stronger R squared in carbon tracker, which is assimilating those sites, but actually the mean bias is larger in carbon tracker than in CAMS. And so that gives us some confidence that, given the sort of errors you would expect in inversions, that we're getting a good handle on what's happening in Siberia and CAMS, even though it's not directly assimilating observations there. So then we can look at how well this approach captures the seasonal cycle amplitude trend. And you can see again that we're doing a pretty reasonable job of capturing that, even that non-assimilated site Teraburka, which is the open circle in Siberia. Although we do see that there is some deficiency in vertical mixing in the model. So the simulated seasonal cycle amplitude gradient is a bit weaker in the model than it is in the observations, which suggests that there's a bit of a problem with the atmospheric transport model, but we don't think that it's enough to drive errors in the conclusions we're making. So now that we've evaluated this approach, we can use the results of our tagged simulations to determine what regions are driving the seasonal amplification. So first, we're going to look at what is the regional attribution of the mean annual cycle. And so what we do for that is we take a time series of CO2, and for the global simulated CO2, so it encompasses fluxes from all regions, We identify the timing of the maximum and the minimum in the annual cycle and calculate the peak to trough difference. And then for the time that the globally influenced CO2 has its maximum minimum, we determine the CO2 from each one of these tracers and use the ratio of the peak to trough for a regional tagged species to the peak to trough amplitude of the global species to determine the contribution to the amplitude. So you can see on the top that at high latitude sites, so those are, we sampled the model at locations where we have observations, that high latitude North America and Siberia contribute pretty equably to the seasonal cycle amplitude. So at high latitude sites, each of those regions contributes about 4 part per million to the seasonal cycle amplitude. And you can see on this inset that the seasonal cycle amplitude at Barrow, average over the last 10 years, is about 18 parts per million. You can see that there's about a 7 part per million contribution from Northern Hemisphere mid-latitudes as well. But if you look at mid-latitude sites, you see similar patterns. The overall amplitude is decreasing, but you can see a proportionally larger influence of mid-latitude ecosystems to the amplitude at mid-latitude sites and so forth for lower latitude sites. And just for comparison, if we look at the contribution to mean annual cycle from Carbon Tracker, it looks pretty similar. So that's good and corroborates the inferences we're making from CAMs. If we look at the fluxes that are behind these contributions to the mean annual cycle, we can see that in gray, the integrated seasonal cycle amplitude of net ecosystem exchange is again pretty comparable between high latitude North America and Siberia, although per area, Siberian ecosystems have a larger overall net ecosystem exchange amplitude than do North American ecosystems. So then if we look at what regions are driving the trend in seasonal cycles, so essentially the difference between the early and the late period that we've simulated, you can see that there's a big difference, and that Siberia is contributing about a factor of 3 more to the amplitude amplification than is high latitude North American sites. So, or high latitude North American ecosystems. So North American Arctic and boreal ecosystems contribute only about 0.5 part per million over this roughly 40-year time period, whereas Siberian ecosystems are contributing 1.5 parts per million. And it's also striking that even at high latitude sites, temperate ecosystems are contributing almost 1.5 parts per million to the seasonal cycle amplification that we're seeing. So there's a remote influence that's driving that high latitude amplification as well. If we look at, again, the fluxes, we'll see that there is essentially no change in either the integrated or the area weighted seasonality of net ecosystem exchange in high latitude North America over on the right. Whereas if you look at Siberia, there's both an increase in the integrated and the area normalized seasonal cycle amplitude. That is basically about a factor of 6 bigger than what we see in the integrated amplification of boreal and Arctic North American net ecosystem exchange. So that analysis was limited to locations where we sampled the model where CO2 is observed, but we can also use the model to get a geographically complete look at what the change in surface CO2 seasonality would be. So here we're looking at the change in the CO2 seasonal cycle amplitude between the early 1980s and the late 2010s. You can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the patterns that we see. You can see especially large simulated changes in amplitude over agricultural regions and very large changes over Siberia. But we can also take a look at what region is driving those changes. And it's really striking that if you look at the yellow area, the grid cells where boreal and Arctic North America is the primary driver of seasonal amplification is really limited to Western Canada, just downwind of Alaska, whereas the geographic region that is primarily influenced by Siberia in olive is much more extensive throughout the high latitudes. But you can see that temperate ecosystems in teal have quite large influence as being the primary drivers of amplification throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And so this outsized role for Siberia versus Arctic boreal North America as a driver of seasonal amplification is pretty interesting, because it tends to agree with observations of greening and browning from satellite. And so these are some results from a paper by B et al. Who looked at greening and browning in North America versus Eurasia. And they saw that in Arctic ecosystems, about 40% of pixels within the Arctic domain were greening in both North America and Eurasia. But in boreal forests, almost 50% of Eurasian boreal forests are greening, in contrast to North American forests, where you see about 15% have a statistically significant trend in greening, and almost 10% show a statistically significant browning trend. And so, we take these results to suggest that the atmospheric data, which are totally independent of these remote sensing observations, are showing the same pattern, that there's sort of heterogeneity in North American greening and browning, which leads to, when you integrate over the domain, no discernible increase in the seasonality of fluxes. In contrast, in Eurasia, where you have strong greening, you get the strong amplification and seasonality of net ecosystem exchange that leads to those large imprints in the atmosphere. However, if you look at a map of where CAMS is showing that there are strong trends in the seasonal cycle of net ecosystem exchange, they don't look exactly like what you would expect from the greening and browning literature. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the inversion might not be capable of resolving flux amplification at the grid cell level to the extent that, that we would like. If we look at CO2 at 500 millibars, we see that it's much more strongly influenced by mid-latitude fluxes. So everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere that you see a statistically significant increase in amplitude at 500 millibars, the primary driver is temperate ecosystems rather than boreal or Arctic ecosystems. And that has to do with the characteristics of atmospheric transport. One interesting result that we came to was that when we look at the aircraft observations, we're not able to detect statistically significant trends in many of these profiles. So here over Alaska, you can see that around 2 kilometers and 5 kilometers in the observations, you can detect a statistically significant trend of about 2 part per million per decade in the amplitude, but you don't get robust trends in either of the models. And we think that that has to do with the fact that there's a large amount of interannual variability in the seasonal cycle. So this is just the last 7 years of the Barrow record at the surface, and the colors go light to dark, early to late, and you can see that the variability would obscure a trend. And Sean did a bootstrapping analysis with the simulations, and those results suggested that over Alaska, at least, you would need about 25 years of continuous aircraft observations in order to detect a trend above the interannual noise. So everything that I've presented so far has been focused on diagnosing rather than attribution. We've done some follow-on work with Danica Lombardazzi at NCAR, who showed that there's a big improvement in CES-M, which is this purple circled model, in terms of its ability to simulate the CO2 amplitude and trend. And another way of looking at it is by looking at individual CO2 sites, Mauna Loa and Barrow. You can see that CES-M2 in purple is doing a much better job at getting the amplitude on top at Mauna Loa and Barrow, but also the trend in amplitude over time. And she showed that a lot of that is due to the fact that CES-M2 includes these managed landscapes. And in particular, in agricultural regions, nitrogen fertilization is a big control on the change in the CO2 amplitude. So the top figure is looking at the difference between two CESM2 simulations. One was a control and one was where nitrogen fertilization has been shut off. And you can see that nitrogen fertilization increases the CO2 amplitude, not only in agricultural regions, but you can also see in Siberia, there's a big contribution from nitrogen fertilization. And then she ran some land-only simulations where fertilization by nitrogen, CO2, and irrigation were excluded, or where climate change was excluded. And you can see that, again, in the land-only simulations, nitrogen fertilization has the largest impact on the seasonal cycle of net biome productivity, which is sort of consistent with the large role that we saw for mid-latitudes in driving that high-latitude amplification, both at the surface and especially in the mid-latitudes. At the process level, it's been a little bit harder to work with CLM to try to incorporate processes that would allow us to better understand what might be driving regional differences between North Americans and Siberia. Leah Birch published a nice paper where she tried to improve CLM5 performance by focusing on phenology in high latitude ecosystems. You can see that she made great gains in having a revised model in blue look more like FluxCom observations, using ILAM to evaluate different facets of land processes. But when it comes to the netflux, it didn't really move the needle very much. And we weren't able in this study to reproduce differences between high latitude North America and Siberia. So that's really what we're planning to work on next. We've been trying to work within CAMS to understand, with the CAMS results, to understand whether in regions of different mean temperature, which you can see on this map on the right, that if you divide the pixels by mean temperature and whether they're, for instance, drying or wetting, or the extent to which they're warming, we can see why there might be differences between Eurasia and North America. But again, I think we're coming to the conclusion that the inversion is probably not sufficient at this spatial scale. And so we have some modeling prepared where we're going to use satellite productivity as an input to Will Weeder's soil testbed to try to get a better handle on what the sensitivity of fluxes in North America versus Siberia would be. So some quick conclusions. Boreal and Arctic ecosystems in Siberia cause about half of high latitude seasonal cycle amplification, whereas North American Arctic boreal ecosystems indicate a much smaller amplification at the regional scale. This continental asymmetry is consistent with satellite greening and browning, and so it's nice that we have two completely independent data sets that are both pointing to different regional responses. We also find that temperate ecosystems play a large role in shaping the annual cycle, even at high latitudes, and process-based simulations in CLM suggest that the dominant cause of this is going to be nitrogen fertilization of agricultural regions. So I'm going to close by acknowledging Steen, Donica, Leah, and Brendan Rogers, who all contributed to this analysis. This was research mostly funded by NASA Carbon Cycle Sciences. And if you're interested in these results, the papers that I mentioned are listed here. So I don't know that there's much time for questions, but I'll stop there.